present. If you haven't gone to see the exhibit as it was moving around town or here at Pioneer Museum, you can actually download all the stories, all the panels from our website. So azhs.org again. It has all those panels for download. We were not expecting a pandemic when we put them up there, but it worked out nicely that you can actually see the whole exhibit from home. This exhibit, I'm just going to give you a quick overview if you don't know about it. This exhibit looks at 21 women and non-binary people who have lived in Flagstaff over the years and tells their stories of resilience. We tried to find a story for each decade from the 1880s when Flagstaff was first founded as Flagstaff to the present. We hit almost every decade. There are a couple of decades that we missed, but these women represent all these stories from across time. So we tried to tell, through their individual lives, we tried to tell the story of Flagstaff's history and also make connections to national history. So this is Flagstaff and America's history through these women's lives. So hopefully people learn not just about these individuals, but also about the time periods they were living in and what was going on in our nation from the 1880s to the present. You can see there's only 21 people. We had to make some very hard cuts as we were finding these stories. I always say that we ran out of time, not women. There were so many more stories that we wanted to tell and found, but we had a limited time to create the exhibit and a limited space in the museum to tell these stories. So this is kind of where we cut it off, but this is not the end of women's history or even these resilient women in Flagstaff. There are so many more stories. So we hope this is a jumping off place for the museum to find more stories of women and kind of bring them into our narrative. I want to tell you real quick about the team that created the exhibit. You can see them here. So we partnered with the Martin Springer Institute at NAU to create this exhibit, and they were a huge help and amazing partners. Bjorn and Melissa are the staff there. You can see them here in this picture. That's Bjorn, Melissa, and then these amazing students. We worked with 10 students over 2 semesters from NAU who helped us to design the exhibit, do all the research, and think through it. The Martin Springer Institute was started by Doris Martin, who is a Holocaust survivor, and she started the program there to promote the values of moral courage, tolerance, empathy, reconciliation, and justice. And so that's kind of their project, doing all sorts of different things, bringing speakers in, doing exhibits, doing talks, to promote these different values and think about our world in relation to the Holocaust, but also in relation to just how people live together on this planet. These young women were instrumental in building this exhibit, so I want to give them a lot of credit. When we started designing the exhibit, we had the idea of resilience. We knew we wanted to work with that topic, but we didn't actually know that we wanted to talk about women's lives. That came from these young women. It just so happened that all the interns who worked on the project were young women. We didn't plan that or seek out women, but that's what we got. And so they were seeing, 2020 is the anniversary of suffrage, of course, and the Me Too movement was in the news. A lot of people were talking about that. They were seeing these stories of women, and they decided as a way to focus the project, why not talk about women, non-binary people's stories? So we owe them a great debt for coming up with this amazing idea. We also wanted to be inclusive, and so that's why we talk about some non-binary folks in the exhibit as well. So it's not just women, but a broader idea of womanhood. And we got to talk about living women. Since we were working with Martin Springer, that is not something that we always get to do at the Historical Society. So it was really fun that we got to work with them and talk. We actually got to talk to some of our subjects, interview them, and hear their stories instead of just reading about them in the past. I'm going to share with you just a couple of pictures of the galleries in case you haven't or won't get to come to the museum, so you can see the panels and what they look like. And this is what you can download, are all these big panels, and you can read them on your computer. They were designed by Jen Saunders, who's a graphic designer here in Flagstaff, and she just did this amazing job. You know, the stories are sometimes very hard. They're intense, they're difficult stories, and so she made these panels so like light and beautiful, and they just really draw you in. So we love the design there. You can see how colorful they are. Got a couple more pictures of the gallery, just so you can see it if you haven't. Some of the artifacts, that's one of the benefits of coming to the museum. Once we reopen, you can see the artifacts in the museum. So we have here the Metz's wedding shoes. They got married wearing these shoes. We have Joan Dorsey here in the case, and her uniforms from high school that you can see over here. And then in the background here, you can see the hearts, the tinfoil hearts from the Molly Blank Jewish Community Center. If you remember, it was vandalized last year, and people from Flagstaff brought these hearts to show support and love for that community, the Jewish community in town. So they let us borrow some of the hearts to put in the exhibit. So those are the galleries. You can get a little taste of what they look like. The first woman I want to talk about is Mary Hart, and she's really important to early Flagstaff history and to the Arizona Historical Society's history. Mary Hart worked right here in the building I'm sitting in, the Pioneer Museum. She was the matron of this hospital. So for those of you who don't know the history of the Pioneer Museum, it began its life as the Coconino County Hospital for the Indigent, built in 1908. And it was the poor farm, they called it. If you could not afford to go to the doctor, pay for your health care, you would come to the hospital and they would help you for free. So Mary Hart, I'll tell you a little about her life before she comes to Flagstaff. She started out getting married very young. She's only 15 years old, and she marries John Fairfield, who's 22 years older than she is. So he's 37 and she is 15. He already has 2 kids from his first marriage. And so she's a stepmom at 15 to 2 little kids. And then she has 5 more of her own with John. They come to Flagstaff, and John is the sheriff here in Flagstaff. So they're living here. She's taking care of the kids. John's the sheriff. It's really rough in Flagstaff. This is in the 1880s, 1890s that they move here. And there's a lot of fights downtown, you know, brawls, shootouts, all sorts of things, stabbings are happening down there. So John tries to break up a fight in a bar, and he gets hit in the head, and he develops brain damage from this injury. He's never the same after that. So he actually has to be sent down to the asylum, as they did at that time. Mary, at that point, she is a single mother now. It seems like they got a divorce at some point. We saw that she was divorced. An article also lists her as widowed, though. So she is alone here in Flagstaff, and a few years later ends up getting remarried. She marries William Hart, and they have another 5 kids. So she has 12 children total. 5 from her first marriage, 5 from the second, and then the stepchildren. And after they get married in 1912, they get a contract to run the hospital here in Flagstaff. So they actually move into this building. If you've ever been to Pioneer, they live upstairs. The superintendent, William is the superintendent, and Mary is the matron of the hospital. So she's actually in charge of all the patient care. She's overseeing the nurses, the cook, and making sure that everything is running smoothly in the hospital. And again, you can imagine at that time, 1890s, early 1900s, she's seeing a lot of disease. A lot of people have influenza. They have dysentery, the whole gamut. She's overseeing all these patients. They're coming in with amputations, the lumber mills, very dangerous work. People are losing fingers, arms, people are getting hit by the train, and she's making sure they're all being well cared for, getting fed, taken care of here at the hospital. Now, at some point, they actually end up divorcing. This surprised especially our students doing the research on this. You know, it's always, you get those stories that women weren't allowed to get divorced early on, but Mary divorces William, but they keep working together at the hospital into the 1930s. So they're still running the hospital together, and she's still the matron after the divorce. I don't know what happened, why they got divorced. One reason that we thought it was incredibly important to share Mary's story in this exhibit is that we weren't talking about her in our own museum. So I've worked here for 5 years, and for 4 of those, I didn't even know her name. I knew there was a superintendent at the hospital. I knew he had a wife. We kind of vaguely mentioned that there was, you know, the superintendent and his wife lived here, but we were not talking about her whole life and the work that she was doing in this very building. And that's part of what the students were thinking when we decided to focus on women, right? Women's stories are so often overlooked in the historical narrative, kind of ignored or, you know, marginalized, thought of as not as important. So we really wanted to share this story in particular because it's about our own building our own space, and a woman who was so instrumental in caring for the Flagstaff community. She's taking care of all the poor folks in town who have nowhere else to go. A lot of people, you've heard moving to the poor farm, poor house. If you were homeless and you had nowhere else to live, people would just stay here at the hospital and live here for years. There were a couple of men who just lived in the hospital because they had nowhere else to go, and they would help out around the hospital and do chores and things to earn their keep here. So she's overseeing all those people and helping them. Here is a picture of the hospital early on. This is taken before she gets here, but a little closer to what it looked like when she was working in the hospital. One of the things that also struck our students when they were researching her is she is buried here in Flagstaff, and her gravestone just reads "Beloved Mother." So they were kind of shocked by that, just because she did do so much work in the community, but then she is only remembered there in the cemetery as a mother. She did have 12 children, and I'm sure they did adore her, but that kind of struck us as a common theme with a lot of women, is that you don't always get remembered for the work you've done or the important contributions. You might only get remembered for your kids or your legacy or your husband or your family in some way. The next woman I want to talk about is Emma Jane Leslie Gonzales Wilson. So another divorcee. When she was living here in Flagstaff, she was married to Gonzales. So the articles we saw that I'll talk about in a minute are all signed Gonzales, but she later divorces him because Gonzales is abusive. We do know that, that's from her own writing. So she drops him and ends up marrying Lewis Wilson later. So we called her Emma Wilson, you can see here, because we didn't want to, you know, use the name of her abuser. We thought that would, so we went with her final name and what she was called in her obituary. She is a very outspoken woman. So you can see here in the pictures some land. This is Flagstaff, downtown Flagstaff. You can see kind of Old Town here, or La Plaza Vieja, the railroad tracks running through town. So Emma, when she moves to town, she buys this chunk of land from some of the early settlers. And this is the main town site that I'm circling early on, that La Plaza Vieja area of town today. And then this is the town site, the historic neighborhood downtown, and part of downtown over here. You can see here's Milton and then Route 66 going this way. So she buys this land, but then as the city expands in the 1890s, they want to use this land for public use, right? The city wants the land, and so they take it, right? They say, this is ours now, we're taking the land. And she fights them. She does not just sit back and let them take this land. She starts writing letters to the newspaper, the Coconino Sun at the time, and saying, this is my land, you can't take it, Flagstaff. She goes to court. She sues the probate court and tries to get the land back. And she takes the lawsuit all the way to the Supreme Court. But sadly for her, in 1892, the Supreme Court does not rule in her favor, And the land, of course, as we know, is given to Flagstaff. And she loses that land. She's very angry about this, ends up moving away from Flagstaff. We don't, as you can see here, I don't have a picture of her. We could not find a picture of her anywhere. We did find her obituary, we found her letters, but we could not find her picture. So we used the land picture to represent her, and this picture of early downtown here. You can see this is where like Crystal Magic is today. And then this other building is Marley's, the sports bar, and this is San Francisco Street there downtown, just as downtown is first being built on this site. So we don't have pictures of her, but we have her words, which is kind of amazing too, because this is something you don't always get for women, right? They don't always leave their written words. Sometimes you'll just have a picture or some, stories from other people. But she was a prolific writer and wrote to the paper, and so you can find all her letters to the editor in the Coconino Sun archives. And you can see from this little chunk I'll read you, she had a very strong voice. So here it says, "Never, I have never been consulted in this matter as a person should be. Can you tell me why?" So she is fighting for herself in these letters to the newspaper and standing up for herself, saying she wants her land back, but she's also writing to support other groups in town. And that's what I'm going to talk about next, is these other folks that she was writing letters of support for in the paper. So Flagstaff is founded in 1882. She's writing these in the 1880s, the late 1880s. Town is just starting to grow. And the first piece of immigration legislation ever passed by the United States is passed in the very same year that Flagstaff is founded, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So saying that Chinese people cannot come to America, cannot immigrate here, the first group to be discriminated against through legislation. So in town, there are some Chinese folks working here in town already by the time they come to work on the railroad, to work in restaurants, to sometimes own businesses. And there's a series of fires that becomes known in the newspaper, at least, as the Chinese problem. So you can see a bit from this piece in the middle here, and I'll read you a little of this. There are these fires happening in downtown. They actually end up burning down all of the first town site, and then they rebuild the new town site. But this committee becomes, or they call themselves the committee, they are appointed to deal with the question of the Chinese problem. And their way of dealing with it is to, as you can see up here, Chinese requested to leave the town by September 1st. So the way they're going to deal with this problem is just to kick out anyone of Chinese descent and force them to leave town. It should be noted, I don't think the Chinese folks were lighting the fires because they were happening in Chinese businesses. So that would suggest it was outside people lighting the fires, causing the problems. But the Chinese folks are being blamed for it, of course, at this time because of that Chinese Exclusion Act, discrimination against the Chinese, very prevalent here in Flagstaff and across the nation. So the committee decides the way to deal with this, kick everybody out. And they put this in the newspaper. And you can see that here. I'll read you this piece of this letter that says, "Flagstaff, Arizona Territory, stated May 5th, 1887, you are hereby commanded to get the Chinamen who reside in your houses in Newtown out of same inside of 10 days or suffer consequences. Signed, committee." So Emma reads this letter in the newspaper, and if you know her, she's not standing for it. So she writes back through the newspaper, and I'll read you this bit of her letter here from May 16th, 1887. She writes, "In answer to the above anonymous letter received this AM, written by a person or persons styling themselves committee on the Chinese question, I have only this to say, that if another spasmodic eviction of Chinamen is to convulse Flagstaff, let it be so. but don't think for a moment to bulldoze me by such letters, much less to make me your servant. Every man, woman, or child our government welcomes to our ports, so far as I am concerned, shall know the meaning of 3 cheers for the red, white, and blue. And you can see that signed Mrs. A.S. Gonzales, because that is who she's married to at that time. So here she is saying, first of all, don't try to push me around and tell me who I can rent homes to or have in my business, have work in my business. And then also, don't try to discriminate against people who have been allowed to come to this country, right, who are here. You can see we don't know everyone who was on the committee, in the committee, because it was an anonymous committee, of course, as they so often are, but this article gives away a little bit in this part. So you can see P.J. Brannan, Dr. Brannan, some names we know very well here at the museum, Salzman. So we did get a couple of names of folks who are on this committee and trying to do this work of kicking out people who should not have been discriminated against or thrown out of town. Here you have a notice as well from the sheriff saying all boys that have been in the habit of throwing stones and clubs at Chinamen will take notice that hereafter they will be promptly arrested for any unnecessary assaults upon Chinamen. So the sheriff at least was trying to say maybe don't harm people, but did this work? Did the committee get what they wanted? No. So Jill, my coworker Jill Huff, was reading through the 1900 census, and she found this page that lists many, you can see here it says China, 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 many names of folks who were living here in 1900. So of course that had happened in 1887. So we don't have the 1890 census because that was lost in the fire. So we're not sure if people did leave for a time or if folks stayed around. But by 1900, there are Chinese people living and working here in Flagstaff. There's another page of them, and you can see their occupations listed over here. So merchant, cook, laundryman, gardener, cook, day laborer. So different jobs that they had in Flagstaff. Which brings us to Yu Wong, who never met Emma Leslie, didn't know her, but was part of the Wong family, a Chinese family that settled here in Flagstaff starting in 1915. So they are the first family to really stick around. There were obviously, as I just showed you, other Chinese people living here, working here, but the Wongs stay, and their family is still in town today. Her youngest son lives down in Tucson, but he comes to visit, and other descendants are still here in Flagstaff. So Yu is an interesting story in relation to that Chinese Exclusion Act that I just talked about, because she is a Chinese citizen, but her husband was an American citizen. This is June Wong, and he was allowed to go back to China and find a wife and bring her to America. So she came here as a very young woman from Canton, China, and she moves here to Flagstaff with her husband, and they open a business. They buy the laundry in town, so the American Laundry, which it was located down on South San Francisco and Phoenix. I'm not sure which corner it was on. But right around where Dartai is and the lumberyard is today. And they raise their family here. So they both work really hard in the laundry. She also has a whole bunch of kids. She has 12 kids total, and has them in the back of the laundry and then gets right back to work, her son said. And they employ a lot of Mexican workers at the laundry. A lot of young women there are working at the laundry. So she does learn to speak a little Spanish. She can speak English, but she never, unfortunately, learns to speak English well enough to pass the citizenship test. Because even though she is married an American, she is not automatically made a citizen. Because of that Exclusion Act, it's even harder. but she would have a path to citizenship, but she was not able to learn. You had to recite like the preamble, and she was not able to learn English well enough to fully read and recite it, even though her kids did try to help her do that. So she lives in this country for her whole life, but she never does get citizenship. But she's a beloved figure here in Flagstaff. You know, everybody knew the family and would go to their restaurant. They opened the American Kitchen downtown, and they served American food, not Chinese food, at that restaurant. The Wongs are, because they were in town so long and still are today, there's a big collection of their photographs and information on Klein Library's website and in their archives. So if you go to Klein Library Special Collections and Archives, you can actually read transcripts from oral histories with two of the sons. You can see lots of pictures of the Wongs, but there's this confusion with their names that comes very much from, you know, Americans not knowing how Chinese names work. So in China, of course, the surname is first. So you would say Huang Jun, Huang Duyu. But here in America, we put the surname last, so you would say Jun Wong. So everybody in Flagstaff thought that Mr. Wong's name was Mr. Jun. So they would call him Mr. Jun. And a lot of the information we have in the archives at Special Collections is actually, the names are switched or wrong and listed as June. And in fact, it was so prevalent that some of the family members, the descendants, actually use June as their last name still today. So that's one thing that we want to keep in mind as we do our research and talk about these stories is, what are people's real names? What do we have the correct information? In fact, we call her Yu Wong, but the family called her Dear Yu Wong. So we even have some discrepancy about what her name really should have been or is officially in our exhibit. So things like that we want to think about kind of on a meta level as we do our work as historians and researchers and try to do the best we can to get things right, even if people are coming from different cultures or different than our own way of doing things. Next, I want to talk about Procora or Guerra Martinez. So they called her Koya, her family. And you can see pictures of her. This is her with her brother, and then her with her niece as well, standing in front of their restaurant that I'll talk about in a minute. So Procora really represents in this exhibit a lot of the Mexican immigrants who came from Mexico to Flagstaff after the Mexican Revolution happened. So things are pretty bad after the Revolution and during the Revolution, and people are moving north to find jobs, to find safety, to make a better life for their families. So Koya and her sister Nina come here first from Mexico, just the two of them as young women. And they start working, they work in restaurants, and they try to save money, and they send money home to the family, and they slowly, Nina's the older one, and she starts trying to bring all the family from Mexico to Flagstaff so they can all be together. So that's how the brother comes, and the rest of the family ends up here in town. They started a restaurant. So Nina opens her own restaurant in Flagstaff. You can see, well, you can't see it here. So this is where it used to be. It's called the Flagstaff Cafe, and it was on South San Francisco Street. In between the mission, the Sunshine Rescue Mission, and the Korean restaurant, Kokyo. So there's now this kind of empty space. But at that time, there was a building here, and that's what she's standing in front of in this picture with her niece. That building is the restaurant. So Koya's story was our story for the 1930s, because during the Depression, her sister had opened this restaurant, and Koya's working in the restaurant. But a lot of people have fallen on very hard times, of course, here in Flagstaff, across the country. They can't afford the food or any food. So what they did at the restaurant was folks could come in the front door and sit down and have a meal and pay. But if you were not able to pay, they had kind of a spoken word agreement with people that you could come to the back door of the restaurant around back and they would give you a meal. No questions asked, just wanted to help the community. So they were feeding people, helping everyone. And her daughter says in an interview that even many years later, people would write to them and send them a check and say, you helped me so much during the Depression, you fed me when I had nothing, so I just want to, now that I want to repay you. So Coe's story is really one of just a regular woman, right? Not the most famous, not the most wealthy. We wanted to use the resilience exhibit to also talk about normal people living their lives in town and doing good in their communities, surviving amazing things, being resilient. But we didn't only want to focus on the most well-known, the first to do something, or as museums so often do, the most wealthy or well-known. We have, of course, also stories about the Reardon Mansion and the folks who live there, the Babbitt family, these larger, very wealthy families. So we tell those stories too, but in this exhibit, we really didn't want to only focus on those types of stories. We wanted to tell about the regular women living their lives who are kind of the backbone of the community, who help, who, raise their families or run a business or do whatever they do to make this a good place to live and help people here in Flagstaff. So Coe is definitely one of those women, and so is Annie Watkins, who will be the last woman that I talk about here during my talk. So unfortunately, I couldn't talk about everyone. I wish that I had more time. We're going to try and do more talks about more of the women, and even maybe have some of the women themselves do talks over the summer and into the fall. But Annie Watkins is a personal favorite of mine. She moved here to go to college, and she went to the Arizona Teachers College at what is now NAU, became a teacher. You can see her here when she was younger. When she graduated, there weren't a lot of teaching jobs for African-American women here in Flagstaff. It was 1953 when she graduated. And as you might know, Flagstaff had already desegregated their schools. So before 1952, schools in town were segregated. You had the Dunbar School, which was for the Black children, South Beaver School, which was for the Hispanic children, and Emerson School for the white students. So they were all separated, but Wilson Riles, who you may have heard of, and his wife Louise Riles, they were teachers at Dunbar. They and a whole bunch of other people in town, Sturgeon Cromer, they fought for desegregation. And they won. They got schools desegregated even before the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down. So Flagstaff was a little bit ahead of the game. But that meant that Dunbar School closed. They no longer needed the school or the teachers. So Wilson and Louise actually moved to California. Annie is actually related to them. So Annie's husband, Joe, you can see their signatures up top there. Joe is Louise's brother. So they are in-laws to the Rileses. The Rileses leave town and move to California, but Annie and Joe stay here. So Annie's graduated. She can't get a teaching job. The school in town already has a Black teacher, so they did not need her at the time. So she's looking for a job, and she kind of stumbles into a job registering voters, which is what our panel will focus on. And I'll show you a little clip about that in just a minute, but I'll tell you a bit more about the rest of her life first. So she does the registering voters for a while, and she is heavily involved here in town with the NAACP chapter, with helping with all these desegregation efforts before it happens, helping to desegregate restaurants and businesses like the Orpheum Theater downtown. And she is registering voters, kind of teaching them how to vote, getting them registered, and she becomes kind of this big force in politics here in Flagstaff. where the candidates who are running come and try to get her help. They try to curry favor with her because she is working in the largest district in Flagstaff, so she has a lot of influence. We knew Annie's story already, and we knew we wanted to include her because she just has this amazing life and all these great stories about Flagstaff and what it was like to share. So we had actually talked about her a bit in our previous exhibit, Todos Unidos, if you saw that one. It was about the Hispanic community in Flagstaff, but we talked about Annie in it, who is Black, because she worked at South Beaver School. So she did go on to become a teacher. She later got a job at South Beaver, and she helped to she was teaching a lot of students who were second language learners who spoke Spanish primarily at home. And some of the other teachers didn't think that they could handle harder work. And she helped to kind of push and say to the principal of the school, no, they can handle the next primer up, and they can do this work even though English isn't their first language. But of course, as you know, kids suck up language really quickly. So she kind of convinced the principal to try some new things at South Beaver. I'll show you a picture of that. So she worked at South Beaver for several years, and then she moved on to Marshall School and spent the bulk of her career here in Flagstaff teaching at Marshall School. And then at the very end of her career, she taught at Killip for a couple of years once that opened. And she retired in 1987. So she spent her whole 31-year teaching career here in Flagstaff, serving this community, teaching kids all over town. And again, just like Koya, she's kind of one of those people who is the backbone of Flagstaff, who is helping, teach people, teaching children, doing this important work, but not necessarily getting a lot of notoriety, as unfortunately teachers don't. And especially African-American teachers often don't get this kind of credit for the important, amazing work that they're doing. So we really wanted to highlight that. In Todos, she also has some great stories to tell about discrimination here in Flagstaff. There's a great story which we don't include in the resilience, but I'll tell you here, about when she and Joe are first married and they're looking to rent a house. And she goes alone out to Greenlaw, where they're building a new housing development. I'll bring this picture up again. And she's very light-skinned, so you can see here she can pass, as they say sometimes. So she goes to Greenlaw, and the landlord there is like, oh yeah, what, here was the houses you can rent. They have like models they're showing her, and she says, well, I have to bring my husband back. He gives her the keys. He says, here, take the keys, bring your husband back later, no big deal, and rent this house. And then she brings Joe back, and Joe has darker skin. The landlord sees him suddenly, oh, we just rented the house. Sorry, we can't rent to you. So some really interesting stories because she is able to pass and kind of see different sides of segregation, different sides of discrimination. She has a lot of fascinating stories to tell about that as well. And of course, her teaching career. So I'll jump here. We are really lucky, again, I'm going to reference Klein Library and the work that they've done, because we relied heavily on it, especially since we were partnered with Martin Springer at NAU. We did a lot of our research in Klein Library's archives, and they have some amazing oral histories available for everyone, anywhere, but anyone in Flagstaff can access them online. So this is Annie Watkins' oral history, and I'm going to play you a little clip from it in just a minute. But these oral histories and pictures and all sorts of amazing documents that Klein has collected, a lot of them are due to Delia Munoz's work. And Delia is another of the resilient women in our exhibit who I didn't talk about here, but I'll just mention real quick because she did this amazing project called Los Recuerdos, where they collected oral histories from primarily the Mexican Hispanic community, but also the African American community, the Chinese community, all minority communities here in Flagstaff. So they recorded these stories from people who lived here and saved them in the archive. And you know, those stories, again, like women's stories, minority stories, are often lost to time, not collected by institutions like the Arizona Historical Society. We've definitely been guilty of this. So we have this amazing work that Delia did, and we love that she did it, and we wanted to honor her by including her in the resilience exhibit as well, and then using some of her work here to tell these stories. So since we have this amazing story, I want to let Annie speak for herself. So I'm going to play you this clip from, I'm just going to play about a minute of this from her oral history. And then if you want to see the rest of it, it is available on Klein Library's Special Collections website. And you can watch the whole video or read the transcript of her oral history, or any of the other folks around who they've taken these wonderful oral histories from. So check those out on Klein's website. The audio is not amazing, so put up, you might need to raise your volume. I'm going to start a little early so that you have a couple of seconds to raise your volume if you can't hear it well. But this is Annie Watkins talking about her time working registering voters here in Flagstaff. I'll stop it there, but it's a fascinating, she has 2 interviews, and she just tells amazing stories about what life was like early on here, well, in the 50s in Flagstaff, and as town was desegregating at first and then kind of growing through the 50s, 60s till the 80s. So do check that out if you are interested. And, oh, sorry, wrong thing. Then thank you so much. So I am gonna unshare my screen, and then Nikki is gonna field some questions for us. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, or perhaps we will turn on the sound if people wanna ask with voices.
I'm going to unmute everyone, and if you want to put your camera on, you're welcome to do so. If you do have background noise, though, go ahead and mute yourself again.
So feel free to either jump in with a question or put it in the chat box, and Nikki will read it if you don't want to read it.
You do not have anything in the chat box yet.
If you don't have questions, that's fine too. I know sometimes people are like, "Oh, give me questions," but that's totally fine with me if we're all good.
If nobody's got a question, I have a comment. What a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I saw the exhibit at the museum shortly before you closed, and it's pretty amazing. And then your presentation really brought it alive. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you got to see it before we closed too.
Yeah.